tuned into the graveyard, and I'm Atlas, still here, still broadcasting, still fighting to make sense of a world that refuses to play by the rules. It's been 4 days since I last spoke to you, but let me assure you, those 4 days haven't been quiet. If anything, the silence has grown louder. The world is shifting survivors. I feel it, and I'm guessing many of you do too. There's something about the nights lately. They felt heavier, thicker, like the air's pressing down on everything. You can feel it when you breathe, like the weight of the world has doubled overnight. I've heard reports from survivors across the range, and the story's the same everywhere. The wind stopped in certain places. Dead zones, they're calling them. Spots where the air doesn't move, where it feels like the world has decided to hold its breath. One survivor described walking into one of these zones near an old bridge. He said it was like stepping into a different world. No wind, no sound, just a suffocating stillness. He stood there for a moment, thinking it was safe, only to realize he couldn't hear his own footsteps anymore. I don't know what's causing it, but it's spreading. If you're out there and the world suddenly goes quiet, don't linger. Trust me, it's not worth finding out what's waiting in that silence. And then there's the air itself. I've noticed it too, this faint metallic tang that seems to creep in near water. The subtle, almost easy to dismiss, but once you catch it, it's impossible to ignore. Rivers, lakes, even small streams, it's like they're exhaling something unnatural. A few survivors have described a similar sensation, saying it gets worse the closer you are to the water. One even reported feeling dizzy after spending too much time near an old reservoir. Whatever it is, it's out there and it's not normal. This world of ours, it's no longer predictable. We've known that for a while now, but every day it seems to find new ways to remind us. For days ago, I might have said things couldn't get stranger. Today, I know better. The rules are shifting survivors, and we're left trying to figure out where the new lines are drawn. But here's the thing. Even when the world feels incomprehensible, patterns emerge if you look hard enough. That's what I've been doing. Watching, listening, piecing together what little clues this world leaves behind. It's not much, but it's something, and right now, something is the best we've got. So let's get into it. The nights aren't just darker. They're longer, heavier, suffocating. Survivors have described seeing strange mist creeping through forests and fields. Not like the fogs we used to know, but something that seems deliberate, almost alive. One person told me they saw it moving against the wind, flowing uphill like it had somewhere it needed to be. They said it swallowed the sound around them, leaving only their heartbeat echoing in their ears. And that metallic tang in the air near water is not just a smell. Some survivors have said they felt it in their lungs, a faint sting with every breath. I've heard accounts of people avoiding these areas altogether, claiming they've seen ripples in the water when nothing was there to disturb it. Is it paranoia? Maybe. But in this world, paranoia has a way of keeping you alive. For days doesn't sound like much, does it? But out here, time isn't measured the same way anymore. It's not about hours or days. It's about what happens within them. And lately, what's been happening feels less like random chaos and more like something deliberate, like the world itself is changing in ways we're just beginning to notice. The graveyard's here to remind you, you're not imagining things. The world is shifting, evolving, and whether we're part of that evolution or just bystanders is a question I don't have the answer to. But I can promise you this, I'll keep looking, I'll keep talking, and as long as I have breath in my lungs and power in my transmitter, you'll have a voice to guide you through the dark. Stay sharp, survivors. We've got a lot more to cover tonight. Let's talk about what's been in the air these past few days. Survivors. It's not just the quiet, not just the stillness. It's the way the air itself feels alive. Heavy, almost charged, like it's carrying something more than oxygen. You feel it pressing on your skin, a weight that isn't there but refuses to be ignored. I first noticed it near an old stream, the kind of place that should have been peaceful. Instead, the air felt thick, oppressive, and every breath tasted faintly metallic. I wasn't the only one. I've had survivors calling in, describing the same sensation. Some say it's worse near water, and I tend to agree. There's something about rivers and lakes now, something wrong. A woman out near the eastern marshlands told me the air shimmered like heat waves above the water, even though the temperature was near freezing. She felt dizzy, almost drunk, and had to crawl her way back to dry land. She said the water seemed alive, like it was watching her. It's not just the air, though. It's what the air does or doesn't do. Wind, for example. There are places now where the wind just stops, like the world has forgotten how to move. These dead zones, as some survivors are calling them, are spreading. I've had reports from deep forests, crumbling city outskirts, even open farmland. One scavenger told me he walked into one of these zones and felt like he'd been dropped into a vacuum. No sound, no breeze, just silence so thick it made his ears ring. He said it wasn't until he stepped back into the wind's reach that he realized how oppressive that silence had been. And the strangest part? These zones aren't random. They seem to cluster near certain landmarks, bridges, cliffs, abandoned factories. Places where nature and humanity used to meet. It's like the earth is reclaiming those spaces, rewriting the rules we thought we understood. Survivors have also reported strange vibrations in the air, faint but persistent, like the hum of power lines. They're hard to hear unless you stop and really listen, but once you notice them, they're impossible to ignore. One man described it as a buzzing in his teeth, a pressure in his chest that grew stronger the closer he got to an old dam. He didn't stick around to investigate, and I don't blame him. I've even heard stories of animals reacting to these changes. A pack of dogs near the riverbanks refused to cross a certain patch of land, barking and whining like something invisible was holding them back. A hunter told me he saw birds circling the same clearing for hours, only to scatter in unison without warning. It's as if nature itself knows something we don't, like it's adapting faster than we can. I don't have answers, survivors, only patterns, only pieces of a puzzle that refuses to come together. But I'll tell you this, these changes aren't just in our heads. The air is shifting, the land is shifting, and whatever's causing it isn't stopping. So, keep your senses sharp. Pay attention to the way the world feels. The weight of the air, the stillness of the wind, the hum in your chest. These are signs, survivors. Signs that the world is changing, and we'd better be ready to change with it. We've got more to cover tonight, so don't go anywhere. This is just the beginning. A few days ago, I came across a small, forgotten town, tucked away in the shadows of a forest that felt older than time itself. From a distance, it looked like any other ruined place. Collapsed roofs, rusting vehicles, and overgrown streets. But the closer I got, the more I realized there was something different about this one. Something intentional. The first thing I noticed was the carvings. They were everywhere, on windowsills, door frames, even on the fences of the old homes that still stood upright. Small, crude figures carved from wood, shaped like animals, people, spirals, and other symbols I couldn't quite place. They weren't haphazardly placed either. Every single one faced outward, as if standing watch over the empty streets. Inside one of the houses, it became even stranger. The place had been abandoned for years, maybe since the early days of the outbreak, but it didn't feel forgotten. The kitchen table was clear of dust, and on it sat a single jar of clean water. Not murky, not half-full, pristine, as though someone had left it there deliberately. The windows of the house were lined with more carvings. Each one had been carefully positioned to face outward, almost like sentries guarding the space. There were spirals again, etched into the wood of the walls, along with strange intersecting lines that didn't match anything I'd seen before. They weren't decorative. They felt purposeful, protective even. I spent hours combing through that house, trying to piece together who might have lived there. Whoever they weren't just hiding. They were preparing. The cupboards were bare, the rooms stripped of anything useful. But there were signs that someone had been there recently. The air had that faint, lived-in smell. Not unpleasant, just human. One of the bedrooms upstairs held the most unsettling discovery. Against the far wall was a child's bed, still neatly made, with a small wooden figure placed on the pillow. It was different from the others, rougher, as though whoever carved it had been in a hurry. It was shaped like a person, but the features were exaggerated. The eyes were large and hollow, the arms stretched wide, and the base was chipped, as if it had been dropped and hastily repaired. There was something about that figure that didn't sit right with me. Felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be there. I left it where I found it and moved on, but the memory of it has been gnawing at me ever since. As I made my way out of the house and into the rest of the town, the carvings became more numerous. Every building had them, sometimes in clusters, sometimes arranged in intricate patterns. It was clear that whoever had lived here believed these symbols served a purpose. But what purpose? Were they meant to ward something off or to invite something in? I don't have the answers, survivors, but I can tell you this. The town wasn't empty. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear a single sound, but I wasn't alone. That much I'm sure of. On my way out of the town, I found something else. A series of markings scratched into the bark of a tree near the edge of the forest. They looked like claw marks at first, but they were too precise, too deliberate. 5 lines, evenly spaced, with a small spiral etched beneath them. I don't know if it was the same person who made the carvings or someone else entirely, but it was a message of some kind. A warning, maybe, or a boundary I wasn't meant to cross. I left the town not long after that. Whatever its secrets were, they weren't meant for me to uncover. But the symbols, the carvings, they stayed with me. They felt like the work of someone who believed in something larger than themselves. Someone who thought they could hold back the chaos, or at least make sense of it. Have any of you seen anything like this? Symbols, carvings, marks that seem to be placed with intent? If you have, you know how to reach me. These might be clues, survivors. Clues to something bigger, something we've only just begun to notice. I've got more to tell you, so don't go anywhere. This is just the beginning of what I found out there. A few days ago, I was traveling along an old stretch of highway, a cracked and overgrown relic of what used to be a lifeline for civilization. The road was empty, or at least it seemed that way at first. The air was heavy with the usual stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the weeds. I'd been moving cautiously, sticking to the side of the road where I could duck behind the remnants of vehicles if needed. That's when I saw it. A figure standing atop an overturned car, silhouetted against the late afternoon light. At first, I thought it was another survivor. They were holding what looked like a staff or a spear, standing perfectly still on the roof of the car. I froze, watching from the cover of a rusted van about 50 yards away. Something about the way they stood unnerved me. There was no hesitation in their posture, no shift of weight or fidgeting like you'd expect from someone scanning the horizon. They were rigid, almost statuesque, as if they were part of the wreckage itself. I stayed low, observing. Minutes passed, and they didn't move, not even a twitch. I started to question if they were even alive, or if they were some kind of scarecrow left behind as a warning. But then, as the light began to shift, they raised the staff in one deliberate motion. No sound, no sudden movement, just a slow, calculated lift. I thought they might be signaling, but there was no one else around. No infected, no other survivors. Just the figure and the empty stretch of road. Then, as if they'd sensed me watching, they turned their heads slightly in my direction. I couldn't see their face. It was obscured by the shadows of the setting sun, but the motion was enough to send a chill down my spine. Before I could decide whether to approach or retreat, they vanished. One moment they were there, standing on the car, and the next, they stepped off the edge and disappeared into a ravine that cut across the highway. I waited, heart pounding, expecting them to reappear or for something, anything, to explain what I'd just seen, but nothing happened. When I finally worked up the nerve to move closer, I found the car empty. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just the faint outline of where they'd been standing in the dust on the roof. What I did find, though, were markings, symbols scratched into the asphalt near the car, deep and deliberate. There were 5 of them, spaced evenly apart, circles intersected by jagged lines, spirals twisting outward, and one that looked like an arrow pointing west. I've seen symbols before, graffiti, desperate scrawls on walls, but these were different. They weren't rushed or chaotic. They were precise, almost ritualistic, as if they'd been left for a specific purpose. I don't know what the purpose was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't meant to be there. The air around the car felt wrong, heavier than it should have been. It was the same kind of weight I felt near the dead zones, the places where the wind doesn't blow and the world seems to hold its breath. As I backed away, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. Were they a survivor, a scout from some hidden group, or something else entirely? Whoever or whatever they were, they wanted to be seen, at least for a moment. And then they wanted to disappear. I've heard stories from other survivors about figures like this, shadowy presences that seem to move with purpose but leave no trace. Some say they're scouts for a larger group. Others think they're lone wanderers who found ways to survive the infection without drawing attention. A few even claim there's something more, something not entirely human. I'm not here to speculate on what they are, but I will say this: they're out there, watching, moving, leaving behind signs we don't yet understand. Whether they're a threat or a warning, I don't know. What I do know is that this world has grown too strange to dismiss anything outright. If you see someone, or something, standing still in the distance, don't rush in. Observe from a safe distance. Look for signs, patterns, anything that might tell you what they're about before you decide to act. Those symbols on the asphalt still haunt me. I've marked them on my map and plan to revisit the area when it feels safer. But for now, they remain a mystery. Maybe they're a message for someone else. Maybe they're a warning. Or maybe they're just one more piece of the puzzle this world has become. I don't have answers, survivors, only questions. But that's the nature of this world now, isn't it? Every corner we turn, every shadow we pass, leaves us wondering what's real and what's just another trick of a fractured mind. There's more to tell, so stay with me. This is only the beginning. A few days ago, I was traveling along an old stretch of highway, a cracked and overgrown relic of what used to be a lifeline for civilization. The road was empty, or at least it seemed that way at first. The air was heavy with the usual stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the weeds. I'd been moving cautiously, sticking to the side of the road where I could duck behind the remnants of vehicles if needed. That's when I saw it. A figure standing atop an overturned car, silhouetted against the late afternoon light. At first, I thought it was another survivor. They were holding what looked like a staff or a spear, standing perfectly still on the roof of the car. I froze, watching from the cover of a rusted van about 50 yards away. Something about the way they stood unnerved me. There was no hesitation in their posture, no shift of weight or fidgeting like you'd expect from someone scanning the horizon. They were rigid, almost statuesque, as if they were part of the wreckage itself. I stayed low, observing. Minutes passed, and they didn't move, not even a twitch. I started to question if they were even alive, or if they were some kind of scarecrow left behind as a warning. But then, as the light began to shift, they raised the staff in one deliberate motion. No sound, no sudden movement, just a slow, calculated lift. I thought they might be signaling, but there was no one else around. No infected, no other survivors. Just the figure and the empty stretch of road. Then, as if they'd sensed me watching, they turned their heads slightly in my direction. I couldn't see their face. It was obscured by the shadows of the setting sun, but the motion was enough to send a chill down my spine. Before I could decide whether to approach or retreat, they vanished. One moment they were there, standing on the car, and the next, they stepped off the edge and disappeared into a ravine that cut across the highway. I waited, heart pounding, expecting them to reappear or for something, anything, to explain what I'd just seen. But nothing happened. When I finally worked up the nerve to move closer, I found the car empty. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just the faint outline of where they'd been standing in the dust on the roof. What I did find, though, were markings, symbols scratched into the asphalt near the car, deep and deliberate. There were 5 of them, spaced evenly apart. Circles intersected by jagged lines, spirals twisting outward, and one that looked like an arrow pointing west. I've seen symbols before, graffiti, desperate scrawls on walls, but these were different. They weren't rushed or chaotic. They were precise, almost ritualistic, as if they'd been left for a specific purpose. I don't know what the purpose was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't meant to be there. The air around the car felt wrong, heavier than it should have been. It was the same kind of weight I felt near the dead zones, the places where the wind doesn't blow and the world seems to hold its breath. As I backed away, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. Were they a survivor, a scout from some hidden group, or something else entirely? Whoever or whatever they were, they wanted to be seen, at least for a moment. And then they wanted to disappear. I've heard stories from other survivors about figures like this, shadowy presences that seem to move with purpose but leave no trace. Some say they're scouts for a larger group. Others think they're lone wanderers who found ways to survive the infection without drawing attention. A few even claim there's something more, something not entirely human. I'm not here to speculate on what they are, but I will say this: they're out there, watching, moving, leaving behind signs we don't yet understand. Whether they're a threat or a warning, I don't know. What I do know is that this world has grown too strange to dismiss anything outright. If you see someone, or something, standing still in the distance, don't rush in. Observe from a safe distance. Look for signs, patterns, anything that might tell you what they're about before you decide to act. Those symbols on the asphalt still haunt me. I've marked them on my map and plan to revisit the area when it feels safer. But for now, they remain a mystery. Maybe they're a message for someone else. Maybe they're a warning. Or maybe they're just one more piece of the puzzle this world has become. I don't have answers, survivors, only questions. But that's the nature of this world now, isn't it? Every corner we turn, every shadow we pass, leaves us wondering what's real and what's just another trick of a fractured mind. There's more to tell, so stay with me. This is only the beginning. I've seen infected gather before. We all have. They roam in packs, stumble into clusters, driven by noise or some residual instinct that pulls them together. It's chaotic, messy, predictable in its randomness. But what I saw recently wasn't any of that. It was something else entirely. I was cutting through a field, a stretch of wild grass that had grown tall and untamed, hiding most of the ground beneath it. I was about halfway across when I spotted them. At first, it looked like a typical group of infected, scattered shapes in the distance, moving slowly, seemingly without purpose. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't random at all. They were walking in a line. Not a perfect line, but close enough to catch my attention. Each one was spaced a few feet apart, following the same path through the grass. Their heads were tilted slightly downward, and their movements were steady, deliberate. They weren't shambling like usual. They were walking, almost as if they had somewhere to be. I dropped low, crouching behind a cluster of tall weeds, and watched. The line stretched out farther than I'd initially thought, winding its way across the field and disappearing over a small hill. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more. None of them deviated from the path. None of them turned back or broke formation. It was like they were connected, moving with a shared purpose I couldn't see. I stayed there for what felt like an hour, watching as they marched on. The strangest part, they didn't seem to be following any noise or movement. The field was silent, the wind barely a whisper. Whatever was guiding them, it wasn't external. Later, I followed their trail. The grass where they'd walked was flattened, forming a narrow path that led to the base of a crumbling overpass. When I reached the top of the hill, I expected to see them scattered around, milling aimlessly like they usually do. But they weren't. They were standing in a loose semicircle at the edge of the overpass, facing the ruins of an old billboard. The infected weren't moving, not even swaying in place. They just stood there, heads slightly tilted upward, staring at the rusted remains of the billboard as if it held some kind of meaning for them. I couldn't see anything unusual about it, just a faded advertisement for a long-gone fast food chain. But to them, it was something. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. Something about the scene felt too calculated, too intentional. I backed away quietly, keeping the hill between me and them, and left the area as quickly as I could. This isn't the only time I've heard of infected moving like this. Survivors across the range have been reporting similar patterns. Infected traveling in straight lines through empty streets, clusters gathering in circles around seemingly random objects, even groups standing motionless in open fields, facing the same direction without explanation. One survivor described seeing infected in the parking lot of an old strip mall. They were spread out in pairs, standing on either side of abandoned cars, almost as if they were waiting for someone to show up. Another scavenger found a group clustered around a rusted-out fountain in the middle of a city square. They weren't drinking, weren't moving, just standing there in eerie silence. These aren't the aimless hordes we've come to know. This is something different, something coordinated. I've been trying to piece it together, but there's no clear pattern, at least not one I can see. Maybe they're drawn to certain places or objects for reasons we don't understand. Maybe it's instinct or something the infection itself is driving them to do. Or maybe it's something worse. The infected have always been dangerous because of their unpredictability. You could count on them to react to noise, to charge at movement, to stumble blindly into traps. But this is the opposite of unpredictable. It's deliberate, it's strategic, and that should terrify all of us. If you see infected moving in unison, don't follow them. I know the urge to understand, to figure out what's happening, can be strong. I feel it too, but the risk isn't worth it. These clusters, these patterns, they're not for us. Pay attention to the spaces they gather in, though. Mark them in your mind or on your map. These places might mean nothing to us now, but if the infected are drawn to them, there's a reason. Whether it's a good reason or a bad one, I don't know. But I do know that when the infected start to act with purpose, it's a sign the rules are changing. And if the rules are changing, survivors, we need to change with them. There's more to discuss, so stay with me. We're only scratching the surface of what's happening out there. A couple of days ago, I found myself wandering into what used to be a gas station. It wasn't much to look at. Half-collapsed roof, shattered windows, and the unmistakable smell of decay hanging in the air. I was running low on supplies and thought maybe, just maybe, something useful had been overlooked. What I found instead was something far stranger. The first thing I noticed was the wall behind the counter. At first glance, it looked like someone had scribbled graffiti across the cracked tiles. A mess of overlapping shapes and lines, hastily scrawled in black paint. But the closer I looked, the more deliberate it seemed. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a map. It wasn't a map of roads or cities, not the kind we'd recognize. This was something else entirely. The landmarks it marked weren't buildings or highways, but things like clusters of trees, jagged rock formations, and streams. One point on the map was labeled with a spiral, another with a triangle intersected by a jagged line. There were no names, no text, just symbols arranged in a pattern that seemed to stretch across an area far larger than the gas station's immediate surroundings. I spent a while studying it, trying to make sense of what it was showing. The spirals were clustered around water sources, rivers, lakes, even a few dried-up creeks. The triangles were scattered near higher elevations, hills and ridges. And then there were the intersecting lines, which seemed to converge at specific points, almost like they were marking places of importance. The longer I looked at it, the more unsettled I became. It felt like the map was telling a story, one that I didn't have the context to understand. Was it a guide, a warning, or something else entirely? It wasn't until I stepped back that I noticed the other markings scattered around the gas station. They weren't part of the map, but seemed related somehow. On the floor near the counter, someone had scratched a series of symbols into the concrete. Circles, spirals, and lines radiating outward, forming what looked almost like a crude compass. On the back wall, just above an old, rusting freezer, was another spiral, this one drawn in what looked like ash. The spiral above the freezer was different from the others I'd seen. It wasn't clean or precise. The edges were smudged, as if whoever drew it had been in a hurry or unsteady. It looked less like a symbol and more like a plea, desperate and rushed. I couldn't help but wonder who had made these markings and why. Were they part of a group, working together to leave some kind of message for others to follow? Or was this the work of a single person, someone desperate to make sense of the chaos around them? What stuck with me most, though, was the sense of purpose behind it all. Whoever left those symbols believed they meant something. Maybe they were trying to warn others away from certain places, or maybe they were marking safe zones, areas they thought were untouched by the infected or whatever else is out there. I've seen symbols like these before, scattered across the ruins of other towns and cities, but never with this level of detail. Never as part of something as intricate as that map. It made me wonder if there's a network out there, a group of survivors trying to communicate in a language we don't yet understand. The question, of course, is whether we're meant to follow these signs or avoid them. Are they breadcrumbs leading us to safety, or are they marking places best left alone? Before I left the gas station, I took one last look at the map and noticed something else. Near the center of the wall, where the intersecting lines converged, there was a small, faint mark I hadn't seen before. It wasn't painted or scratched in like the others. It looked burned, as if someone had pressed a red-hot brand against the tile. The shape was unfamiliar, a jagged circle broken by 3 slashes, almost like a claw mark. Whatever it meant, it wasn't part of the original map. Felt like an addition, an afterthought. A warning, perhaps, left by someone who had seen what lay at the end of those converging lines. I took a photo of the map with the small camera I've been carrying, but the quality is poor, and the details are hard to make out. If I can get a better look at it later, I'll try to trace its patterns and compare them to the places I've been. Maybe there's a connection I've missed. If you've seen anything like this, symbols, spirals, maps that don't make sense, I want to hear about it. These markings might mean nothing, or they might be the key to understanding the changes we're seeing in the world. Either way, we can't ignore them. The infected aren't the only mystery out here. The land itself is speaking survivors, and we need to start listening. There's more to uncover, so don't go anywhere. We're just getting started. Survivors, I don't think the land beneath our feet is the same as it used to be. Over the last few weeks, I've been hearing stories, too many to ignore, about strange changes in the earth itself. And just a few days ago, I saw it with my own eyes. It started when I was making my way through an area I thought I knew well, a stretch of overgrown fields and dirt paths that used to lead to an old farm. The land there had always been uneven, full of roots and small sinkholes that made walking a cautious affair. But this time it was different. The ground wasn't just uneven, it was moving. I stopped when I felt it, a faint tremor beneath my boots, almost imperceptible at first. I thought it might have been my imagination or the wind shaking the tall grass. But then I noticed the grass itself, rippling in waves as if something beneath the soil was shifting. It wasn't the kind of movement you'd expect from an animal burrowing underground. It felt bigger, heavier, like the earth itself was breathing. I didn't stick around to find out what was causing it, but the sensation stayed with me long after I left that field. I've heard similar accounts from survivors across the range. People have described patches of ground that feel soft, like stepping on a mattress, even in places where the soil should be solid. Others have reported sinkholes appearing out of nowhere, swallowing entire sections of road or forest. One scavenger I spoke to told me about a sinkhole he encountered while searching for supplies near an old quarry. It wasn't just a collapse of dirt and rock. The edges of the hole were lined with spirals of grass and roots, twisted in patterns that looked deliberate, almost designed. He said the hole wasn't deep, but it felt like it stretched endlessly downward when he stood at the edge and looked in. Another survivor described finding a series of small sinkholes clustered around a dried-up stream. Each one was perfectly round, like someone had punched a hole straight through the earth. When he dropped a rock into one, he said he didn't hear it hit the bottom. It's not just sinkholes either. The ground itself seems to be changing in ways that defy logic. In some places, survivors have reported patches of soil that are warm to the touch, even in freezing temperatures. One woman said she found a stretch of asphalt on an old road that was hot enough to melt the soles of her boots. There was no fire, no visible source of heat, just the ground radiating warmth as if something beneath it was burning. And then there are the patterns. I've seen them myself. Spirals in the grass, twisted tree roots that seem to rise unnaturally from the soil, even cracks in the pavement that form shapes too precise to be random. They're subtle, easy to miss if you're not looking for them, but once you notice, you can't unsee them. I've been wondering if these changes are connected to the infection somehow, or if they're a sign of something else entirely. Is the land adapting, reshaping itself in response to the chaos around it? Or is it something deeper, something we don't yet understand? Some survivors believe these changes are warnings. One man told me he avoids any area where the ground feels off, claiming it's a sign the infected are nearby. Another said he's seen infected clustering around sinkholes, standing at the edges as if guarding something hidden below. I can't confirm any of this, but I will say this: the land is no longer neutral. It's shifting, evolving, and it doesn't seem to care whether we notice or not. If you come across areas where the ground feels strange, soft, warm, or pulsating, take note of your surroundings. Look for patterns in the soil, the grass, even the trees. These places might hold answers, or they might hold dangers we're not ready to face. I've started marking these locations on my map, trying to piece together a larger picture. So far, the patterns don't make sense, but I'm hoping that over time they will. If any of you have seen similar phenomena, let me know. The more we share, the better our chances of understanding what's happening. The Earth has always been our foundation, the one thing we could rely on even as everything else fell apart. But now, even that is changing. And if the ground beneath us is no longer stable, what does that mean for the rest of us? There's more to discuss, survivors. Stay with me. This is only the beginning of what we need to uncover. Survivors, let's talk about something practical: tools, methods, little tricks that might keep you alive out there. I've been experimenting, testing what works and what doesn't, and I think I've stumbled onto something worth sharing. It's not a weapon, not a barricade. It's a mirror. It started when I was scavenging through an abandoned house a few miles outside the city limits. The place was in better shape than most, with windows still intact and furniture that hadn't been entirely destroyed. I was rummaging through a bathroom cabinet when I found it. A small, handheld mirror. The kind you'd see in every home back when vanity mattered more than survival. I almost left it behind. What use is a mirror in a world where the only thing staring back at you is exhaustion? But something told me to take it, so I slipped it into my bag. That decision might have saved my life. A few hours later, I was moving through a narrow alley when I heard them. Infected. They were close, too close. I ducked behind an overturned dumpster, keeping as quiet as I could, but I could hear their uneven footsteps echoing against the walls. There wasn't enough time to turn back, and the only other way out was blocked by rubble. I didn't know what else to do, so I pulled out the mirror, hoping to use it to peek around the corner without exposing myself. But the moment I angled it toward the alley, something strange happened. The infected froze. I didn't make a sound. I didn't move, but through the mirror, I could see them standing there, heads tilted slightly, as if they were trying to process what they were seeing. They didn't charge. They didn't even stumble closer. They just stopped. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, holding the mirror steady, watching as they shifted their weight from one foot to the other. Eventually, they turned and wandered off, as if whatever they'd seen no longer interested them. At first, I thought it was a fluke, a coincidence, but I've tested it since then, and the results are consistent. Infected react to reflections. I don't know why. Maybe it confuses them, makes them think there's another presence nearby. Maybe it scatters the light in a way their altered senses can't process. Or maybe it's something deeper, something tied to the infection itself. What I do know is that it works. A small, polished surface, a mirror, a piece of metal, even the screen of a shattered smartphone, can buy you time. It's not foolproof, and it won't work in every situation, but in the right circumstances, it can give you those precious seconds you need to escape. I've also heard from other survivors who've stumbled onto similar tactics. One man told me he used the reflection from a broken car mirror to distract a group of infected while he climbed to safety. Another survivor described hanging shards of reflective glass from tree branches around her camp, creating a perimeter that seemed to deter infected from wandering too close. There are limits, of course. Reflections won't stop them if they've already locked onto you. And they don't seem to work in low light. Whatever triggers their reaction, it relies on clear, visible reflections. But in daylight or even under a bright moon, it's enough to tip the odds in your favor. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That something as simple as a mirror could become a tool for survival. It makes me wonder about the nature of the infection, about what it's doing to the infected on a sensory level. Are they drawn to reflections because they see themselves? Or are they repelled by the unfamiliar, by the distortion of light and shape. Whatever the reason, it's a tool we can use. And in this world, every tool matters. If you're out scavenging, keep an eye out for reflective surfaces. A compact mirror can fit in your pocket, and even a small shard of polished metal can be enough to make a difference. If you have time, test it yourself. See how the infected react and learn how to use it to your advantage. I've also been experimenting with other ways to use reflections. Hanging reflective surfaces at odd angles can create distractions, drawing infected toward them while you slip away unnoticed. Shining light onto a reflective surface can scatter it, creating multiple points of focus that seem to confuse them even further. It's not a perfect solution, and it won't work in every situation, but it's one more weapon in our arsenal. And right now, we need every weapon we can get. The infected are evolving. We've seen it in their behavior, in the way they move and respond to the world around them. If they're adapting, then we need to adapt too. We need to think beyond traditional tools and tactics to find new ways to outsmart a threat that refuses to stay the same. So, survivors, the next time you're out there, take a moment to look for something reflective. It might not seem like much, but in this world, even the smallest things can tip the scales. There's more to discuss, so stay with me. This is far from over. Survivors. There's something unsettling spreading across the land. It's not just the infected, not just the strange phenomena we've been seeing. It's the silence. A silence so deep and pervasive that it feels alive. I first noticed it a few nights ago while camped out near the remains of an old overpass. The wind was calm, the stars bright, conditions that should have been perfect for listening to the sounds of the night. But there was nothing. No insects chirping, no distant rustle of leaves, not even the faint hum of the earth beneath me. Just silence. At first, I thought it was a blessing. Quiet means safety, right? No infected, no threats, just the rare stillness of a world that's been far too loud with chaos. But the longer I sat there, the more that silence began to feel wrong. It wasn't natural. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break it. I wasn't alone in noticing this. Survivors have been reporting similar experiences across the range. Pockets of silence that seem to swallow sound, creating zones where even the loudest noise feels muted. One scavenger described walking through an abandoned neighborhood where his footsteps didn't echo, where the crunch of broken glass beneath his boots was barely audible. He said it felt like the world was trying to erase him one sound at a time. Another survivor told me about a stretch of forest where the silence was so heavy, it made her ears ring. She said it was like stepping into a void, where even her breathing felt too loud. She didn't stay long. None of us do when the world feels like that. What's causing these zones of silence? I don't have answers, only theories. Maybe it's something to do with the infection, a byproduct of whatever's transforming the world. Or maybe it's the land itself, reshaping the rules of nature in ways we can't yet comprehend. What I do know is that the silence isn't random. It's spreading, creeping into places that used to be full of sound and life. Rivers that once roared now flow quietly, their currents muted as if the water has forgotten how to speak. Forests that should be alive with the chatter of birds and insects are now as still as tombs. Even the infected, for all their groaning and stumbling, seem to go quiet in these zones, their movements subdued and deliberate. It's not just the absence of sound that's disturbing, it's the way it makes you feel. The silence isn't empty, it's heavy, pressing against you, making every breath, every heartbeat, feel amplified. Survivors who've spent too much time in these zones describe feeling watched, as if the silence itself is alive, aware of their presence. One traveler recounted an experience near a small, dried-up lake. The silence there was so intense, it made him dizzy, disoriented. He said he felt something brushing against him, even though there was nothing there. When he turned to leave, he found himself stumbling, unable to keep his balance. It was as if the silence was holding him in place, refusing to let him go. Another survivor told me about encountering infected in one of these zones. He said they were standing still, as they sometimes do, but their behavior was different. They didn't respond to his presence. didn't react to his movements. They just stood there, silent and motionless, as if they were part of the landscape. These zones are spreading survivors. They're appearing in places that were once vibrant, loud, full of life. And the more they spread, the more they seem to consume not just sound, but the energy of the places they touch. If you come across one of these zones, don't linger. Move quickly, but move quietly. Avoid making unnecessary noise, even if the silence feels like it's swallowing everything you do. The last thing you want is to draw attention to yourself in a place where the world feels like it's listening. And pay attention to the edges of these zones. Survivors have reported feeling the shift as they cross into them. A sudden drop in sound, a pressure in their ears, like stepping into a vacuum. If you notice these signs, turn back if you can. The silence isn't just unsettling, it's dangerous. I've been trying to map these zones to understand their patterns, but they're unpredictable. They appear and disappear without warning, making it nearly impossible to track their movements. One day, a road might be safe. The next, it's swallowed by the void. The silence is changing the way we survive. It's forcing us to adapt, to rethink the rules we've come to rely on. We used to think that noise was the enemy, that staying quiet was the key to staying alive. But now, the quiet itself has become a threat, a force that feels as alive and dangerous as the infected. So, survivors, keep your ears open, not just for sound, but for its absence. The silence is growing, and it's not something we can ignore. There's more to uncover, so stay with me. We've still got ground to cover. Survivors, let's talk about messages. Cryptic warnings, scattered signs, and the words left behind by those who walked this broken world before us. They're everywhere if you know where to look. Scrawled on walls, carved into trees, etched into the sides of vehicles abandoned on the roads. They're relics of desperation, fear, and maybe, just maybe, wisdom. A few days ago, I came across one of these messages. It was on the side of an overturned truck, faded but still legible. The words were painted in a streaky red that could have been anything, from rust to something more grim. Run. Don't look back. It was the kind of warning you'd expect in this world, short, panicked, direct. But what caught my attention was the symbol painted beneath it, a spiral intersected by 3 slashes. I've seen that symbol before in other places left by other hands. It always seems to show up near danger, near places where the rules of survival feel like they're being rewritten. That same day, not far from the truck, I found another message. This one carved into a wooden signpost marking the edge of a ruined town. The sky listens. That was all it said, but those 3 words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. The carving was fresh, the wood splintered and pale where the blade had cut through the weathered surface. I didn't stay in that town for long, but I kept seeing the same phrase repeated on walls, doors, and even on the pavement in faded chalk. The sky listens. What does it mean? Is it a warning? A superstition? Or is it something real? Something we've yet to understand? It's not the first time I've encountered these kinds of messages, and it won't be the last. Survivors leave them behind like breadcrumbs, marking the places they've been, the things they've seen, and the dangers they've faced. But there's a pattern to them, one that feels deliberate. Take the messages near water, for example. Over the past month, I've noticed an increase in warnings near rivers, lakes, and streams. They all carry the same themes. Don't linger, don't trust the stillness, don't let the water touch you. One survivor told me about a note they found pinned to a tree near a riverbank. It said, "It's in the roots." What's in the roots? The infection? Something worse? The survivor didn't stick around to find out, and neither did I when I came across a similar note a week later. Then there are the warnings about the north. Don't go north. I've seen that phrase more times than I can count. Scratched into concrete, painted on rusted signs, even written on the back of a broken mirror. Survivors who've ignored the warning rarely return, and the ones who do are different. They talk about unnatural cold, about shadows that don't move with the light, about a feeling of being watched that never goes away. I've heard whispers of a place up north where the infected don't behave like the ones we've grown used to. They move with purpose in groups that seem to think as one. They don't make a sound, not even when they attack. I don't know if these stories are true, but the messages tell me enough to know that north is a direction best avoided. The thing about these warnings is that they're not always clear. Some are cryptic to the point of being meaningless, like a message I found carved into the side of a derelict train car. We are trespassers now. What does that mean? Trespassers where? On what? The land? The world? But even the cryptic ones carry a certain weight. They remind us that we're not the first to face this nightmare, and we won't be the last. They're echoes of the people who came before us, of their fears and their attempts to make sense of a world that no longer makes sense. Sometimes, though, the messages feel less like warnings and more like conversations. A few days ago, I saw something that still chills me. On the wall of a crumbling building, someone had scrawled, "Who's left?" And beneath it, in different handwriting, was the reply, "Not you." It was a grim reminder that not every survivor is looking out for the rest of us. Some see these messages as opportunities, traps laid out to lure the desperate and the curious. It's why you have to be careful, to weigh every word you see against the risks of following its advice. If you come across one of these warnings, take a moment to consider its meaning. Look at the context, the surroundings. Is it pointing you toward something or steering you away? Is it a warning for you or a message meant for someone or something else? Pay attention to the symbols, too. Spirals, triangles, intersecting lines. These shapes show up more often than coincidence would allow. They're part of a language we don't yet understand, a code left behind by people who saw something we haven't. I've started documenting these messages whenever I can, writing them down alongside the locations where I find them. It's not much, but it's a start. Maybe someday we'll piece together what they mean and why they matter. Until then, survivors, keep your eyes open. The world is speaking to us, in whispers and warnings, in signs and symbols. It's up to us to listen, to learn, and to survive. There's more to uncover, so stay with me. We're not done yet. Survivors, we've covered a lot tonight. From the changing behavior of the infected to the strange shifts in the earth beneath our feet. From cryptic warnings to unexplained zones of silence. It's clear that the world we once knew is gone. What remains is something else entirely. Something that demands we adapt or perish. As I sit here, staring out into the dark horizon, I can't help but reflect on what we've become. Survivors, yes, but also witnesses to a world transforming in ways we still don't understand. Every day we wake up is a victory, and every step we take is a gamble. The rules have changed, and they're still changing. I think about the messages I've seen, the warnings carved into walls, the symbols etched into the earth, the cryptic notes left behind by those who came before us. They're fragments of a story we're only beginning to piece together. They remind us that even in the face of chaos, people tried to leave something behind, a trail for us to follow or avoid. But here's the thing, we can't rely on those warnings alone. We have to stay sharp, stay vigilant. The infected are evolving, becoming something more coordinated, more deliberate. The land is shifting beneath us, reshaping itself in ways that defy explanation. And the silence is growing. I've seen it in the patterns, in the way certain places seem to draw infected or repel sound. I've felt it in the weight of the air, in the strange stillness that settles over the world when the wind refuses to blow. It's not just a feeling anymore. It's a reality we have to face. The infected aren't our only threat. The land itself seems to be turning against us, and the signs are everywhere if you know where to look. Spirals in the grass, strange heat radiating from the ground, sinkholes that appear without warning. These aren't random occurrences. They're part of a larger picture, one that's still coming into focus. And then there are the figures, the ones who stand in the distance, watching but never approaching, the ones who leave behind symbols and maps, who seem to know more about this world than we do. Are they survivors like us, trying to make sense of the chaos? Or are they something else entirely? I don't have the answers, but I know this much. They're out there, and they're not idle. So where does that leave us? Survivors? What do we do with all of this? The warnings, the signs, the changes we can't ignore. We adapt. We learn. We pay attention to the details because the details are what will keep us alive. If you see a symbol etched into a tree or painted on a wall, take note of it. If you feel the ground tremble beneath your feet, don't dismiss it as coincidence. If you hear the silence growing around you, don't linger. These aren't just anomalies. They're warnings, clues, pieces of a puzzle that might one day make sense. We have to stay connected, even if it's just through the faint whispers of a radio signal. Share what you see, what you hear, what you feel. Every piece of information, no matter how small, could be the key to understanding this new world. And don't lose hope. I know it's hard. I know the nights feel endless and the days are filled with dangers we can't always see. But hope is what separates us from the infected, from the silence, from the void, is what keeps us human. I'll keep broadcasting as long as I can, sharing what I've seen and heard, piecing together the fragments of a world that's slipping further away. And I'll keep listening, too, for your voices, your stories, your warnings. This is Atlas, signing off from the graveyard. Stay safe, survivors. Stay sharp. And remember, you're not alone, not as long as we're still here, still fighting, still holding on to the threads of what was and what might still be. The night is long, but it won't last forever. Let's make sure we see the sunrise together.